October 25th, 1944, 0647 hours. Philippine Sea, off Samar Island. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, studying the horizon through Zeiss binoculars that had cost more than a Japanese worker earned in 5 years. The most powerful warship ever built cut through calm waters at 24 knots, her 18.1-inch guns trained forward, ready to deliver destruction measured in tons of high explosive per salvo. Behind Yamato, 22 warships formed the most powerful surface action group the Imperial Japanese Navy could assemble in October 1944. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Kurita's mission was simple: destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Intelligence reported dozens of vulnerable transports and supply ships, protected only by escort carriers and their screens. The American fleet carriers, the real threat, were hundreds of miles north, lured away by a decoy force. For the first time since Midway, Japanese surface forces had achieved tactical surprise and overwhelming superiority. Through the early morning haze, Kurita's lookouts spotted masts, then hulls, then the unmistakable silhouettes of aircraft carriers. The Americans had been caught completely unprepared. Kurita's chief of staff, Captain Tamiji Koyanagi, permitted himself a rare smile. They sent us their leftovers, escort carriers and destroyers. This will be a massacre. What neither Kurita nor Koyanagi knew, what nobody in the Imperial Japanese Navy could have predicted, was that they were about to engage in what historians would call the most lopsided naval battle in modern warfare, and that by day's end, the Japanese would retreat in defeat, pursued by ships they had dismissed as floating coffins. The destroyers screening those escort carriers were designated destroyer escorts by the U.S. Navy, unofficial nickname tin cans for their thin armor and light construction. 7 of them were about to write the most extraordinary chapter in naval history, proving that tonnage and firepower meant nothing against crews who refused to accept that mathematics determined victory. This is the story of how contempt became respect, how superiority became survival, and how Japan's mightiest warships learned that Americans didn't need the biggest guns to win. They just needed to be willing to charge directly at death without hesitation. The Fletcher-class destroyer that would become the centerpiece of this battle, USS Johnston, DD-557, had been commissioned on October 27, 1943, at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation. At 376 feet long and displacing 2,100 tons standard, 50 tons fully loaded, she represented the U.S. Navy's most successful destroyer design of World War II. But compared to the ships she would face at Leyte Gulf, Johnston was a rowboat challenging battleships. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded, nearly 24 times Johnston's weight. Yamato's main battery of 9 18.1-inch guns could fire 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells to a range of 26 miles. Each shell weighed more than Johnston's entire crew. Johnston's main battery consisted of 5 5-inch 38 caliber guns, effective for anti-aircraft work and engaging destroyers, but utterly inadequate for penetrating battleship armor. The mathematics were absurd. Yamato's belt armor was 16 inches thick, hardened steel that could stop any shell Johnston could fire. Johnston's maximum armor thickness was 0.5 inches, barely enough to stop shell fragments, useless against anything larger than machine gun fire. A single hit from one of Yamato's main guns would vaporize Johnston. A near miss would sink her through sheer concussive force. Yet Johnston's commanding officer, Commander Ernest E, had made his philosophy clear during the commissioning ceremony. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. Evans was part Cherokee, raised in Oklahoma, graduated from the Naval Academy in 1926. He was 40 years old in October 1944. Ancient by destroyer skipper standards. Most destroyer commanders were in their late 20s or early 30s. But Evans had spent 18 years preparing for command, studying tactics, understanding his ship's capabilities and limitations, and developing an aggressive fighting philosophy that prioritized action over survival. His executing officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, would later write, "The captain believed that destroyers won through aggression, that the enemy expected us to be cautious, to maintain distance, to use our speed for evasion. He intended to do the opposite. Close to minimum range, attack with everything we had, and make the enemy react to us, rather than letting us react to them." This philosophy was about to be tested against the most powerful surface force Japan could deploy. The battle group that Johnston screened was designated Taffy 3, one of 3 escort carrier groups supporting the Leyte invasion. Under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitcun Bay, and Gambier Bay, screened by 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. The escort carriers were converted merchant hulls, slow and lightly armed. Maximum speed, 17.5 knots. Armament, 1 5-inch gun, multiple anti-aircraft weapons. Aircraft capacity, approximately 28 aircraft per carrier. They were designed for anti-submarine warfare and close air support, not surface combat. Their flight decks were wooden. Their hulls were unarmored. A single 8-inch shell could gut them. Commander Evans was in his sea cabin when general quarters sounded at 0645. He reached the bridge within 20 seconds, pulling on his helmet, grabbing binoculars. The lookouts were pointing northeast. Evans raised his glasses and saw what every destroyer captain feared: pagoda masts. The distinctive multi-tiered superstructures of Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers, unmistakable even at 17 miles distance. Commander Evans' fire control officer, Lieutenant Edward DeGardy, was already calculating range, course, and speed. Multiple contacts, bearing 045, range 34,000 yards, speed approximately 25 knots, course 200. Configuration matches Congo-class battleships and Tone-class cruisers. The tactical situation was hopeless. Taffy 3 was sailing generally east-southeast, making 16 knots, launching aircraft for routine anti-submarine patrols. Kurita's force was to the northeast, making 24 knots on an intercept course. The Japanese had speed advantage, range advantage, firepower advantage, and the weather gauge. In less than 30 minutes, they would be in gun range of the escort carriers. Admiral Sprague's first signal was brief. Airplot, make ready all aircraft, launch everything that can fly. His second signal was grimmer. Small boys, lay smoke and prepare for torpedo attack. Small boys was Navy slang for destroyers and destroyer escorts, the expendable screen whose job was to die protecting high-value assets. Sprague was ordering his 7 escorts to charge directly at 23 Japanese warships and buy time with their lives for the carriers to escape. Most destroyer captains would have hesitated. The order was suicide. But Commander Evans had been waiting his entire career for this moment, the chance to prove that aggression and determination could defeat superior force. At 0650, before receiving explicit orders, Evans ordered flank speed and turned Johnston directly toward the Japanese formation. His intercom announcement was characteristically blunt. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Johnston accelerated to 35 knots, her engineering crew pushing the Babcock and Wilkes boilers beyond rated capacity. Turbines screaming, the entire ship vibrating as 60,000 horsepower drove her through the water. Evans ordered smoke generators activated. Dense chemical smoke poured from Johnston's fantail, creating a screening wall between the Japanese and the carriers. Lieutenant DeGardy had a firing solution on the nearest heavy cruiser, Kumano, flagship of Cruiser Division 7. Range 18,000 yards and closing. Johnston's Mark 15 torpedoes had a maximum range of 10,000 yards at high speed, 15,000 yards at slow speed. Evans intended to close to 10,000 yards before launching, point-blank range in naval warfare, where his torpedoes would be faster and more accurate. The Japanese spotted Johnston immediately. A single destroyer charging a battleship formation was either insane or desperate. Kurita's ships opened fire at maximum range. The first salvos fell short, creating massive waterspouts that drenched Johnston's bridge with spray. The second salvos straddled her, bracketing her course with columns of water 60 feet high. Evans kept coming, through waterspouts, through near misses, through shell fragments that tore at Johnston's superstructure. He maintained course and speed, closing the range. At 14,000 yards, he could see the Japanese ships clearly. The massive pagoda masts, the turrets training to track him, the flags streaming from signal halyards. At 10,000 yards, Evans ordered full-spread torpedo launch. 10 Mark 15 torpedoes leapt from their tubes, their compressed air launch systems sending them into the water with barely a splash. Set to run at 46 knots, they would reach the Japanese formation in approximately 3 minutes. Evans immediately ordered hard left rudder, turning Johnston to unmask her aft torpedo mount while presenting a smaller target profile. The maneuver saved her ship. A salvo of 14-inch shells from battleship Congo passed through the space Johnston had occupied seconds earlier, so close that the concussion knocked men off their feet. The aft torpedo mount fired its remaining 5 torpedoes at a different target, heavy cruiser Kumano. Then Evans ordered hard right rudder, maximum smoke, and ran for cover while his torpedoes raced toward the enemy. At 0659, Johnston's torpedoes reached the Japanese formation. Kumano, unable to maneuver in time, took a hit forward. The torpedo exploded against her bow, blowing off approximately 40 feet of her forward hull. The heavy cruiser slewed to port, flooding, her speed dropping to 16 knots. Kumano would take no further part in the battle, forced to withdraw toward Brunei with her bow nearly gone. Evans had scored first blood. A single destroyer, displacing 2,100 tons, had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser, but the price was about to come due. As Johnston emerged from her smokescreen to observe the results, Japanese gunners found their mark. The first hit came from an 8-inch shell fired by heavy cruiser Tone. The projectile penetrated Johnston's thin hull plating amidships, exploded inside the after fire room, killing everyone inside instantly. The explosion ruptured steam lines, scalding more men, and destroyed one of Johnston's 2 engine rooms. Speed dropped to 17 knots. The second hit, moments later, came from a 6-inch shell that struck the bridge. The explosion killed or wounded most of the bridge personnel. Commander Evans, standing fully exposed on the starboard wing, was hit by shrapnel in multiple places. 2 fingers on his left hand were severed. His face and neck were torn by fragments. His left ear was partially destroyed. Blood poured from multiple wounds. Lieutenant Hagen found Evans still standing, gripping the windscreen with his right hand, blood soaking his uniform. "Captain, you need medical attention." Evans's response would become legendary. "I can still calm the ship. Resume firing." Johnston's forward guns, still operational, continued engaging targets at maximum rate. The 5-inch 38 guns could fire 15 rounds per minute. Against battleship armor, the shells were ineffective, but against cruiser superstructures and destroyer targets, they caused damage and forced evasive maneuvers. More importantly, they demonstrated to the Japanese that this destroyer refused to acknowledge it was beaten. The battle was now fully engaged. USS Hull, DD-533, and USS Heermann, DD-532, had followed Johnston's lead, charging the Japanese formation, firing torpedoes, then retiring under smoke. The 4 destroyer escorts, smaller, slower, more lightly armed, were making their own desperate torpedo runs. Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato's bridge, was confused. American doctrine called for destroyers to screen high-value assets, not sacrifice themselves in suicidal charges. The aggressive attacks suggested American fleet carriers were nearby, hidden in rain squalls, preparing to launch massive airstrikes. Kurita ordered his formation to maneuver defensively, spreading out to avoid torpedoes rather than concentrating fire on the escort carriers. This caution, born from underestimating American destroyer tactics, was exactly what Admiral Sprague needed. Every minute the Japanese spent evading torpedoes was another minute for the escort carriers to launch aircraft and open range. By 0730, Johnston had retired into smoke, her engineering crew performing miracles. Though one engine room was destroyed, the remaining boilers and turbine could still push the ship to 17 knots. Not enough to escape, but enough to maneuver. Damage control teams had sealed flooding compartments. Medical personnel treated wounded in spaces turned into makeshift aid stations. Gun crews loaded and fired with mechanical precision despite knowing their shells couldn't sink anything they were shooting at. Commander Evans, his face wrapped in bandages, blood still seeping through, directed Johnston from the port wing of the bridge, using voice commands since the ship's internal communications were partially disabled. His tactical assessment was grimly accurate. They couldn't run, they couldn't hide, and they couldn't win. But they could fight. And in fighting, they could buy time. At 0735, Admiral Sprague ordered all remaining escorts to make another torpedo attack. Johnston, despite her damage, responded immediately. Evans ordered course toward a formation of Japanese destroyers that was maneuvering to attack the escort carriers. The Japanese destroyers were fresh, undamaged, and mounting torpedoes specifically designed to sink capital ships. The deadly Type 93 Long Lance, capable of 49 knots for 22 miles, carrying a 1,080-pound warhead. Johnston closed to 7,000 yards, visual range, and opened fire with all operable guns. The Japanese destroyer squadron, surprised by the audacity of a crippled American destroyer attacking them, scattered. Their torpedo attack was disrupted, their formation broken. They would spend the next 20 minutes reforming rather than attacking the carriers. It was in this phase that the Japanese began to understand what they were facing. These American destroyers weren't screening units following doctrine. They were commanded by men who had decided that dying while attacking was preferable to dying while retreating. That psychological reality changed the tactical calculus entirely. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, commanding destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, DE-413, exemplified this mindset. Samuel B. Roberts displaced only 1,300 tons, smaller than a fleet destroyer, more lightly armed, slower. It mounted only 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedo tubes. Against heavy cruisers and battleships, she was utterly outmatched. Copeland didn't care. At 0750, she charged directly at heavy cruiser formation, close to 4,000 yards, less than 2 miles, and fired her 3 torpedoes. Then, with no torpedoes remaining and suicidal courage, she continued closing, firing her 5-inch guns at cruisers that outweighed her ship 10-1. Samuel B. Roberts' gun crews fired so rapidly that the barrels overheated. They fired so many rounds that they exhausted ready ammunition and had to load from the ship's magazine, passing shells up by hand because mechanical hoists were damaged. They scored over 40 hits on heavy cruiser Chikuma, inflicting damage that would eventually force her withdrawal toward Brunei. At 0851, Japanese return fire finally found Samuel B. Roberts. A 14-inch shell from battleship Congo struck aft, penetrating through the deck and exploding in the engineering spaces. The explosion broke the ship's keel. Samuel B. Roberts was doomed, settling rapidly. Copeland ordered abandoned ship. Of 224 crew members, 89 were killed. The survivors spent 50 hours in the water before rescue. But Samuel B. Roberts had achieved her mission. It had disrupted Japanese formations, forced evasive maneuvers, and demonstrated that American fighting spirit couldn't be measured in tons of steel. Johnston's final phase began at 900. By then, she had been fighting continuously for over 2 hours. She had expended all her torpedoes. She had fired over 400 5-inch shells, nearly her entire ammunition load. Her speed was reduced to 12 knots from cumulative damage. Her hull was perforated by dozens of shell hits. Her superstructure was shredded. Fires burned throughout the ship, but she remained in action, continuing to engage any Japanese ship that came within range. At 0920, a squadron of Japanese heavy cruisers spotted Johnston limping behind the smokescreen. They closed for the kill. Haguro, Tone, and Chikuma, 3 heavy cruisers mounting 8 8-inch guns each, opened fire at 10,000 yards. Johnston had no torpedoes to shoot back, insufficient speed to escape, and guns that couldn't penetrate cruiser armor. Commander Evans ordered his remaining guns to continue firing. If Johnston was going to die, she would die fighting. The forward gun mount scored hits on Haguro's superstructure. The aft mount, still operational despite the ship's catastrophic damage, continued firing until its ammunition was exhausted. At 0945, a salvo from Haguro struck Johnston amidships. 3 8-inch shells penetrated the hull, exploding inside. The ship shuddered, slowed, began listing to port. Another salvo struck forward, destroying the last operational gun mount, killing the crew instantly. A third salvo struck the bridge, finally silencing the ship's command center. Commander Evans, still on the bridge wing, gave his final order: abandon ship. Lieutenant Hagen helped Evans over the side into the water. Evans was last seen swimming away from the sinking ship despite his wounds, helping injured crew members stay afloat. He was never found. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. USS Johnston sank at 10:10, approximately 50 miles off Samar Island. Of her 327 crew members, 186 were killed or missing. The survivors spent 2 days in shark-infested waters before rescue. As Johnston slipped beneath the waves, something extraordinary happened. A Japanese destroyer, passing close to the survivors in the water, rendered honors, officers saluting, crew standing at attention. Captain Koyanagi, observing from his command ship, reportedly said, "Those Americans fought like samurai." It was the highest compliment Japanese naval officers could give. The battle off Samar continued for another 3 hours, but the outcome had already been decided. Admiral Kurita, his formation scattered by destroyer attacks, his cruisers damaged, his destroyers disrupted, and facing continuous air attacks from the escort carrier's aircraft, ordered retreat at 0925. The most powerful Japanese surface force assembled since Midway withdrew without accomplishing its mission. The strategic context was staggering. Kurita's force had been designed to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. Had he succeeded, he would have slaughtered dozens of transports and cargo ships, killed tens of thousands of American troops, and potentially delayed the liberation of the Philippines by months. The strategic consequences would have prolonged the Pacific War. 7 American destroyers and destroyer escorts had prevented this outcome. They had charged battleships with 18-inch guns, sacrificed themselves to buy minutes, and through sheer aggressive determination had convinced Admiral Kurita that he faced a far stronger force than he actually did. The casualty statistics tell the story of sacrifice. Taffy 3's 7 escorts began the battle with approximately 2,100 officers and enlisted men. By battle's end, over 1,100 were casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The casualty rate exceeded 50%, higher than any other surface action in U.S. Navy history. Yet they had accomplished the impossible. The 6 escort carriers they protected all survived, though Gambier Bay was sunk and others damaged. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf remained intact. MacArthur's campaign to retake the Philippines continued uninterrupted. The battle off Samar became the decisive action that ended Japanese naval power as a strategic factor in the Pacific War. The Japanese assessment, recorded in post-battle reports, revealed complete bewilderment. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Battleship Division 1, wrote in his diary, "The American destroyers attacked with a ferocity and determination that defied rational calculation. They charged capital ships as if they possessed equal firepower. Their casualties were horrific, yet they never hesitated. This is not the behavior of rational men following doctrine. This is the behavior of fanatics or heroes. We do not understand this American fighting spirit." Admiral Kurita's official report was more analytical but reached the same conclusion. The enemy's coordinated destroyer and air attacks suggested the presence of fleet carriers nearby. The aggressive tactics employed by what we later determined to be escort carriers and their screens indicated desperate defense of high-value assets. My decision to withdraw was based on incomplete intelligence and the need to preserve forces for subsequent operations. This assessment was technically accurate, but missed the essential truth. Kurita had been psychologically defeated by ships he should have brushed aside. The tin cans he had expected to sink quickly had instead fought with such ferocity that he assumed they were screening something far more dangerous. His caution, while professionally defensible, revealed that Japanese naval doctrine had no response to American kamikaze destroyer tactics employed by living crews. The irony was profound. In November 1944, Japan would begin using actual kamikaze aircraft, suicide weapons designed to trade one pilot's life for one ship. But at Leyte Gulf, American destroyer crews had achieved the same effect without being designed as expendable weapons. They had simply been led by commanders who understood that sometimes victory requires charging towards certain death and hoping determination can defeat mathematics. The technical analysis of the battle revealed how completely outmatched the American destroyers were. Johnston's 5-inch guns, firing armor-piercing shells, could penetrate a maximum of 3.7 inches of armor at 10,000 yards. Yamato's belt armor was 16 inches thick. Even at point-blank range, Johnston shells couldn't penetrate battleship protection. They could damage superstructure, destroy fire control equipment, kill exposed personnel, but they couldn't sink a battleship. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns, firing 3,200-pound shells, could penetrate 16 inches of armor at 20 miles. A single hit would vaporize a Fletcher-class destroyer. The disparity in firepower was approximately 500 to 1. Yamato could deliver 500 times more destructive energy per minute than Johnston. Yet Johnston had crippled heavy cruiser Kumano with a single torpedo, had disrupted Japanese destroyer attacks, had forced capital ships to maneuver defensively, and had tied down firepower that should have been concentrated on the escort carriers. Her value in the battle exceeded what any mathematical formula could calculate. The post-war examination of Kumano's damage revealed that Johnston's torpedo had struck at the optimal location, the bow below the waterline in an unarmored section where the explosion created maximum flooding. The hit was partially luck, partially good fire control, but primarily the result of Evans' decision to close to point-blank range where his torpedoes couldn't miss. Kumano survived the war but never fully repaired. She was sunk by submarine USS Gitaro SS-363 on November 25, 1944, while attempting to reach repair facilities in Japan. The damage inflicted by Johnston's torpedo had reduced her to a cripple that couldn't defend herself. The human dimension of the battle emerged in survivor accounts. Seaman First Class Robert Billy, Johnston's gunner's mate, was in the forward 5-inch mount when the bridge was hit. We felt the ship shudder. The intercom went dead. We didn't know what happened to the captain or if anyone was left alive topside. Our mount captain, I don't remember his name, said keep firing until someone tells us to stop, so we did. We fired every shell in the ready magazine. Then we passed shells up from below. The barrel was so hot you couldn't touch it. The paint was burning off, but we kept firing because nobody told us to stop. When the order finally came to abandon ship, we were surprised. We'd been fighting for so long we forgot we were losing. The mount was full of smoke and heat and noise. We stumbled out onto the deck and saw the ship was sinking. Holes everywhere, fires everywhere, men jumping overboard. We jumped too. In the water, we looked back and saw our mount was still pointing at the Japanese. We'd fought until the ship went down. Lieutenant Hagen, Johnston's executive officer who survived, provided the most detailed account of Commander Evans' final moments. The captain was badly wounded but refused to go below. He stayed on the bridge wing, directing the ship until the hit that destroyed the bridge. I found him afterward, still conscious, covered in blood. He helped me get wounded men over the side. His last words to me were, "Make sure the men are taken care of." Then he swam away. I never saw him again. The water was rough, visibility was poor, men were scattered. I like to think he found others and helped them survive. That's the kind of officer he was. The broader tactical implications of the Battle off Samar reshaped American naval doctrine. The aggressive destroyer tactics employed by Evans and other commanders became standard teaching at the Naval War College. The principle was simple. In desperate situations, aggressive action that disrupts enemy plans is superior to defensive action that merely delays defeat. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, summarized the battle in his official dispatch. The action off Samar represents the finest example of destroyer tactics in naval history. Against overwhelming odds, without hope of survival, the destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 engaged the enemy with a ferocity that turned a certain American defeat into a strategic victory. Their sacrifice exemplifies the highest traditions of the naval service. Admiral William Halsey, whose decision to pursue the Japanese decoy force had left Taffy 3 unprotected, was more succinct. The men of Taffy 3 pulled my ass out of the fire. I owe them everything. The Japanese perspective emerged decades later as veterans spoke more freely about the war. Captain Toshio Abe, commanding destroyer Nowaki during the battle, reflected in a 1982 interview. We expected the American destroyers to launch torpedoes from maximum range and then retreat. This is a sensible tactic. Instead, they charged directly at us, closing to point-blank range, firing continuously. It was insane, but it was effective. Their aggression disrupted our formations, forced us to maneuver defensively, and cost us precious time. After the war, I studied at the U.S. Naval War College. I learned that American destroyer doctrine emphasized aggressive action. But doctrine is one thing. Actually charging battleships with destroyers is another. The captains at Leyte Gulf were either crazy or incredibly brave, probably both. The legacy of USS Johnston extended far beyond her 2-hour battle. The Fletcher-class destroyer program had produced 175 ships between 1942 and 1944, representing the most successful destroyer design in history. These ships fought in every theater, escorted countless convoys, conducted shore bombardments, rescued downed airmen, and formed the backbone of the U.S. Navy's surface forces. But Johnston became the exemplar of what these ships could achieve when commanded with audacity and crewed with determination. Every subsequent Fletcher-class captain knew the story of Commander Evans charging Yamato. Every crew knew that their ship was capable of extraordinary feats if they were willing to pay the price. The numbers tell the story of American destroyer production. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States built 349 Fletcher-class destroyers, plus hundreds of other destroyer types and destroyer escorts. This production rate, approximately 1 destroyer every 5 days, meant that losses like Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts could be replaced faster than combat could destroy them. Japan, by contrast, built approximately 60 destroyers during the same period. Losses couldn't be replaced. Every ship sunk was gone forever. This industrial disparity meant that even when Japanese tactical superiority was overwhelming, as at Leyte Gulf, strategic reality ensured American victory. But industrial capacity alone doesn't explain Leyte Gulf. The Soviet Union had industrial capacity, the British Empire had industrial capacity, yet neither produced the kind of aggressive destroyer tactics that characterized American operations. Something in American naval culture, perhaps the frontier spirit, perhaps the emphasis on individual initiative, perhaps the democratic tradition that encouraged junior officers to make command decisions, created commanders like Evans who would charge battleships rather than accept defeat. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the most successful American naval commander of the Pacific War, analyzed this cultural factor in a 1950 lecture. American democracy produces a unique type of military leader. We don't train our officers to blindly follow doctrine. We train them to accomplish the mission using whatever means are available. This creates initiative, flexibility, and occasionally reckless courage. The Battle off Samar exemplifies this philosophy. Commander Evans saw what needed to be done, buy time for the carriers to escape. He determined that the only way to accomplish this was to charge the Japanese formation with torpedoes. Doctrine said this was suicide. He did it anyway. That's American naval warfare at its finest. The survivors of Johnston remained connected throughout their lives. They held reunions every 5 years, maintaining the bonds formed during those desperate hours off Samar. At their 1969 reunion, they commissioned a memorial plaque at Arlington National Cemetery, honoring Commander Evans and all who died with Johnston. The inscription reads, "They fought against overwhelming odds, with courage that defied reason and determination that honored their ship, their service, and their nation." In 2019, 75 years after the battle, a private expedition led by entrepreneur Victor Vescovo located Johnston's wreck. The ship rests in 20,406 feet of water, deeper than any previously discovered shipwreck. The expedition's ROV captured video of the wreck, showing the forward gun mount still trained toward what had been the Japanese formation, the hull remarkably preserved in the cold, deep water. The discovery generated renewed interest in the battle. A new generation learned about Commander Evans and his crew. Documentary films were produced. Books were written. The story of the destroyer that charged battleships became part of American naval mythology. But for those who fought at Leyte Gulf, no mythology was necessary. They knew what they had accomplished. They had faced death and charged forward anyway. They had done what their training, their doctrine, and their leaders had prepared them to do: engage the enemy with maximum aggression, regardless of odds. The final accounting reveals the scope of the achievement. Taffy 3's 7 escorts, combined displacement approximately 15,000 tons, engaged Kurita's force, combined displacement approximately 350,000 tons. The tonnage ratio was 23-1 in favor of the Japanese. The firepower ratio was even more lopsided, yet Taffy 3 forced the Japanese to withdraw. American losses: Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts sunk. Hirman and Dennis damaged, but survived. Japanese losses: Kumano crippled, Suzuya sunk by air attack, Chikuma damaged and later sunk, 3 destroyers damaged. The exchange ratio measured in ships favored Japan, but measured in strategic impact, the Americans won overwhelmingly. The invasion of Leyte proceeded uninterrupted. MacArthur's campaign to liberate the Philippines continued. The Japanese combined fleet would never again sortie as a unified force. The Battle off Samar marked the effective end of Japanese surface naval power, and it had been achieved by ships the Japanese had mocked as floating coffins, commanded by officers the Japanese couldn't comprehend, crewed by men who simply refused to accept that superior firepower guaranteed victory. The Japanese commanders who survived the war carried memories of Leyte Gulf until they died. Admiral Kurita never fully explained why he withdrew when victory seemed certain. He mentioned the destroyer attacks, the airstrikes, the need to preserve forces. But colleagues suspected the real reason was simpler. He had been shaken by the ferocity of American resistance. He had expected the destroyers to flee. Instead, they had charged. That psychological shock had created hesitation at the critical moment. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita died in 1977, age 88, having never written a complete account of the battle. His official reports existed, his tactical decisions were documented, but his thoughts, his assessment of why he withdrew, remained private. Those who knew him suggested he carried guilt about the decision until his death, believing he should have pressed the attack despite the destroyer opposition. Captain Koyanagi, Kurita's chief of staff, was more forthcoming in post-war writings. "We underestimated American determination. We calculated based on firepower and tonnage. We never considered that American crews would fight with such desperation that mathematical calculations became irrelevant. When a destroyer charges a battleship, you must recalculate everything. We didn't. That's why we lost." The legacy of Leyte Gulf reshaped both navies. The U.S. Navy incorporated aggressive destroyer tactics into doctrine permanently. The small boys became elite units, sought-after commands for ambitious officers. The destroyers that had been support vessels became primary combatants, whose value exceeded their tonnage. The Japanese Navy, already broken by attrition, effectively ceased to exist after Leyte Gulf. The remaining ships had no fuel, no trained crews, no strategic purpose. They were sunk at moorings or abandoned. Japan's naval war ended not with climactic battle, but with quiet dissolution. The comparison between opening and closing attitudes reveals the transformation. In October 1944, Japanese commanders viewed American destroyers as inferior vessels, thin-skinned, lightly armed, tactically unsophisticated. By November 1944, surviving Japanese officers viewed American destroyers with fear and respect bordering on awe. This transformation occurred because of battles like Leyte Gulf, where 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts proved that courage could defeat firepower when applied with absolute conviction. The Fletcher-class destroyer program represented American industrial philosophy applied to naval warfare. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, an average of one every 8 days. Each ship required 250,000 rivets, 70 tons of welding rod, 85 miles of electrical cable, and 2,100 tons of steel. The construction process, refined to assembly line efficiency, allowed shipyards to complete hulls in as little as 120 days from keel laying to commissioning. Japan, fighting with limited industrial capacity, built 32 destroyers during the same period, roughly 1/6 of American production. Every Japanese destroyer sunk represented an irreplaceable loss. Every American destroyer sunk could be replaced within weeks. This industrial disparity meant that tactical victories for Japan required impossible casualty ratios. They had to sink 6 American ships for every one they lost just to maintain parity. At Leyte Gulf, the casualty ratio favored Japan in ships sunk, but America in strategic impact. The Japanese had forced Taffy 3 to lose 3 escorts in 1 escort carrier, but they had failed to reach the invasion fleet. They had been turned back by ships they should have destroyed in minutes, and they would never again sortie as a unified fleet. The survivors of USS Johnston spent 50 hours in the water before rescue. Sharks circled constantly. Men died from wounds, exhaustion, and exposure. The Japanese destroyer that had saluted them passed close enough to rescue them, but didn't. International law didn't require enemies to rescue survivors during active combat operations. An American destroyer escort finally picked up the survivors on October 27th. Of Johnston's 327 crew members, 141 survived. Commander Evans was not among them. Multiple survivors reported seeing him in the water, helping wounded men, maintaining morale, and refusing to let anyone give up. Then he was gone. Some thought he went under quietly. Others believed sharks took him. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on November 24, 1944. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." The families of Johnston's crew received telegrams in November 1944. The standard text, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you," began notifications that would devastate households across America. But alongside the grief came stories of heroism. Survivors wrote letters to the families of deceased crew members, describing how their sons and husbands had died fighting. These letters, preserved in family archives, tell stories of men who knew they were doomed, yet continued fighting because that was what their training, their honor, and their shipmates demanded. Mrs. Ernest Evans received her husband's Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony in April 1945. President Roosevelt, gravely ill but insisting on presenting the award personally, told her, "Your husband demonstrated courage that will inspire generations of naval officers. He charged battleships with a destroyer. He turned certain defeat into a strategic victory. He proved that American sailors fear nothing when properly led." The tactical lessons from Leyte Gulf were incorporated into U.S. Navy doctrine within months. The principle of aggressive destroyer action against superior forces became standard teaching. The specific tactics, smoke screens, torpedo attacks from multiple angles, continuous harassing fire, were analyzed and refined. Future destroyer commanders studied Evans' decisions, understanding that sometimes the mathematically impossible becomes tactically necessary. But more than tactics, Leyte Gulf demonstrated something about American naval culture that couldn't be taught. The willingness of commanders to exceed their orders, to take initiative in desperate situations, to risk everything on aggressive action rather than accept cautious defeat, this characterized American destroyer operations throughout the Pacific War. The comparison with Japanese destroyer doctrine revealed fundamental differences. Japanese destroyers were superbly designed, their Type 93 torpedoes superior to anything America deployed, and their crews trained to night combat standards that exceeded American capabilities. Yet Japanese destroyer commanders operated within rigid tactical doctrines that prioritized preservation of forces and adherence to battle plans. Initiative was discouraged. Aggressive action that deviated from orders was career-ending. Commander Evans would have been court-martialed in the Imperial Japanese Navy for charging battleships without orders. In the U.S. Navy, he received the Medal of Honor. That difference, the cultural acceptance of aggressive initiative, proved decisive in dozens of engagements throughout the Pacific War. The industrial statistics tell the broader story. By October 1944, the United States had built destroyers, 349 Fletcher-class, plus hundreds of other types. Destroyer escorts, 563 units of various classes. Escort carriers, 122 units. Fleet carriers, 24 units. Battleships, 10 units. Japan's production during the same period: destroyers 32 units, destroyer escorts, none, different classification system. Light carriers 6 units, fleet carriers 6 units, battleships 2 units, both Yamato class. The production ratio exceeded 6-to-1 in favor of America across all ship types. This meant that Japan couldn't afford to trade ships with America under any circumstances. Even favorable casualty ratios, 2 American ships for 1 Japanese, represented strategic defeat because America could replace losses and Japan couldn't. Admiral Kurita understood this reality. His withdrawal from Leyte Gulf wasn't cowardice, it was recognition that losing his force would accomplish nothing strategically, even if he destroyed every American ship at Leyte. Japan needed those battleships and cruisers to defend the home islands against the coming invasion. Losing them in a tactical victory that didn't change the war's outcome would have been pointless. But this calculation ignored the psychological dimension. The Japanese Navy had been psychologically defeated by American destroyers. Future engagements would be influenced by memories of ships that charged when they should have fled, that fought when they should have died, that turned mathematical impossibilities into tactical realities. The final statistics of the Battle off Samar revealed the scope of the achievement. American forces engaged. 6 escort carriers, total displacement 57,000 tons. 3 destroyers, total displacement 6,300 tons. 4 destroyer escorts, 5,400 tons. Total 68,700 tons. Japanese forces engaged. 4 battleships, 161,000 tons. 6 heavy cruisers, 78,000 tons. 2 light cruisers, 11,000 tons. 11 destroyers, 22,000 tons. Total, 272,000 tons. Tonnage ratio, 4-to-1 in favor of Japan. Firepower ratio, approximately 10-to-1 in favor of Japan. Result, American strategic victory. The human cost was distributed unevenly. Taffy 3 suffered 1,583 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The 3 sunken escorts accounted for most deaths. Johnston, 186 killed. Hull, 253 killed. Samuel B. Roberts, 89 killed. Japanese casualties were lighter in absolute terms, approximately 500 killed, but represented irreplaceable losses in trained personnel. More significantly, the psychological casualties couldn't be quantified. Admiral Kurita never explained his withdrawal satisfactorily. He provided tactical justifications, the destroyer attacks, the airstrikes, the need to preserve forces, but colleagues believed the real reason was simpler. He had been shaken by encountering enemies who refused to acknowledge they were beaten. That shock had created hesitation at the critical moment. The transformation of Japanese attitudes toward American destroyers paralleled German experiences with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Initial contempt, tin cans, floating coffins, evolved into fear and respect. Japanese officers who survived the war described American destroyers with tones usually reserved for natural disasters: inevitable, unstoppable, terrifying. Captain Tameichi Hara, commanding destroyer Shigure at Leyte Gulf, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The American destroyers fought with a fury I had never witnessed. They charged capital ships as if they themselves were battleships. Their tactics defied all logic, yet they were effective. We destroyed several of them, but they accomplished their mission, protecting the escort carriers and forcing us to withdraw. What I could never understand was why they didn't retreat. Their commanders must have known they couldn't win. Yet they charged anyway. That kind of fighting spirit cannot be defeated through superior firepower alone. It requires breaking the enemy's will, and the Americans' will never broke." Admiral Natome Ugaki, commander of Battleship Division 1, was more analytical in his diary. The American destroyer attacks at Leyte Gulf revealed a fundamental weakness in our tactical planning. We assumed destroyers would behave rationally, attacking from maximum range and then withdrawing. We never planned for destroyers that would deliberately close to point-blank range and accept casualties to disrupt our formations. This American willingness to trade ships for tactical advantage represents a strategic approach we cannot match. Our ships are irreplaceable. American ships are expendable components of an industrial system that produces faster than combat can destroy. This industrial logic defeats our tactical superiority every time. The post-war assessment by U.S. naval historians confirmed Ugaki's analysis. The Battle off Samar succeeded not because American ships were superior, they weren't. It succeeded because American commanders understood that, in desperate situations, aggressive action that creates uncertainty for the enemy is superior to defensive action that merely delays defeat. Commander Evans understood this intuitively. So did the other destroyer commanders at Leyte Gulf. They recognized that their mission, protecting the escort carriers, required buying time regardless of cost. The only way to buy time against overwhelming enemy forces was to create chaos through aggressive attacks that forced the enemy to react defensively. The tactics worked because they exploited a vulnerability in Japanese operational doctrine. Japanese commanders expected enemies to follow predictable patterns. Destroyers should maintain distance and launch torpedoes. When engaged by superior forces, destroyers should withdraw under smoke. These expectations created predictable Japanese responses, concentrating fire on the main threat, maneuvering to avoid torpedoes, maintaining formation integrity. American destroyers at Leyte Gulf did none of these things predictably. They charged when they should have withdrawn. They closed to point-blank range when they should have maintained distance. They continued fighting when they should have surrendered. This unpredictability created confusion that proved more valuable than firepower. The legacy of Leyte Gulf extended far beyond the Pacific War. The battle became required study at the Naval War College. Every destroyer commander studied Evans' decisions, analyzing when aggression was justified versus suicidal. The consensus: in desperate situations where defeat is certain through defensive action, aggressive action that might create unexpected opportunities is justified even if it seems suicidal. This principle influenced U.S. Navy operations during the Cold War and beyond. The aggressive destroyer tactics employed in the Tonkin Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and other hotspots traced their doctrinal lineage to Leyte Gulf. The willingness of American naval commanders to take initiative and exceed formal orders became a defining characteristic that adversaries had to account for in their planning. The survivors of Taffy 3 maintained connections throughout their lives. They held reunions every 5 years, gathering to remember fallen comrades and celebrate survival. At their 1969 reunion, they established a scholarship fund for descendants of Taffy 3 crew members. By 2019, the fund had supported over 200 students through college. At their final reunion in 1994, the 50th anniversary of the battle, only 41 survivors remained from the 7 escorts. They were elderly men, many in wheelchairs, but they gathered to honor the memory of ships that had been their homes and comrades who had been their brothers. Robert Billy, Johnston's gunner's mate, who had fought until ammunition was exhausted, spoke at the reunion. "We were kids. Most of us weren't old enough to vote. We'd never been in combat. We didn't know what we were doing was impossible. Commander Evans told us to fight, so we fought. When the ship was sinking, we jumped into the water. When we were rescued, we were surprised we'd survived." It wasn't until years later that I understood what we'd done. We'd stopped the Japanese Navy. 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts had turned back battleships and cruisers. That shouldn't be possible, but we did it because we didn't know we couldn't. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, Johnston's executive officer, who had helped Commander Evans over the side, provided the closing reflection. "Commander Evans taught us that fear is irrelevant when duty is clear. We were afraid. Anyone who says they weren't is lying. But fear didn't matter. Our job was to protect the carriers. The only way to do that was to attack the Japanese fleet, so we attacked." People call it heroic. It wasn't. It was simply doing our jobs. The Japanese had bigger ships, bigger guns, more armor, but they didn't have better crews or better leadership. That's why we won. Not because we were braver, but because we were better led and better trained. Commander Evans once told me, "The enemy expects us to be rational. That's our advantage. When we do something irrational, like charging battleships with destroyers, we create opportunities that rational tactics can't achieve." That philosophy won the Battle off Samar. The wreck of USS Johnston, discovered in 2019, rests deeper than the Titanic, deeper than the Bismarck, deeper than any previously found military shipwreck. The ship sits upright on the seafloor, her forward gun mount still trained toward where the Japanese fleet had been, frozen in her final moment of defiance. The discovery generated renewed interest in the battle. A new generation learned about the destroyers that charged battleships, the crews that refused to surrender, and the commanders who demonstrated that courage could defeat mathematics when applied with absolute conviction. The final word belongs to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who summarized the Battle of Samar in his operational report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The action off Samar represents naval warfare at its finest. Destroyers and destroyer escorts, massively outgunned, chose to engage rather than evade. Their aggressive action disrupted enemy formations, forced the abandonment of enemy objectives, and preserved American forces. No higher commendation can be given than to state the obvious. They were victorious against overwhelming odds through courage, leadership, and determination. The Japanese had called them tin cans, floating coffins, ships that would die easily when real warships arrived. They had been half right. The ships did die, but they died fighting, died accomplishing their mission, died proving that tonnage and firepower meant nothing against crews led by commanders who understood that sometimes victory requires charging toward death without hesitation. The thunder of Johnston's guns had silenced Japanese mockery. The courage of 7 small ships had turned certain defeat into strategic victory. And the lessons learned at Leyte Gulf, that aggression defeats caution, that initiative overcomes firepower, and that American naval officers led from the front would echo through naval warfare for generations. Commander Evans charged battleships with a destroyer and forced them to retreat. That sentence should be impossible, but it happened. The tin cans had fought back, and the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from the psychological shock of discovering that American destroyers feared nothing when properly led. The laughter had died in the smoke and chaos off Samar. By the time the guns fell silent, Japan's most powerful surface force was retreating from ships they should have brushed aside in minutes. The tin cans had won. And in winning, they had written the most extraordinary chapter in naval history. Proof that courage, leadership, and determination could defeat any enemy, regardless of the odds.